recherche qui n'a pas pu être là aujourd'hui, Fabrice Quérault, et aussi ma directrice adjointe, Madeleine Voga, qui est là avec nous, qui va vous dire quelques mots. Je voudrais les remercier pour leur soutien à l'organisation du colloque, à l'organisation de ce projet également.
Merci Vanessa. Bienvenue. Je parle en français, hein, pas en anglais. Hein, ok. Donc, bienvenue. Je vous souhaite la bienvenue. Nous sommes bien sûr particulièrement heureux déjà que ce thème linguistique a pu voir le jour, hein, n'est-ce pas? Donc, déjà, sous le mandat de l'ancienne, de la précédente directrice Anita González-Raymond, et bien sûr, dans le quinquennal 2020-2025, nous avons gardé le thème linguistique et nous l'avons enrichi avec de nouveaux projets, comme par exemple le projet VariaR, dont nous sommes très fiers. Évidemment, la variation, moi je suis linguiste, hein, moi aussi, donc plutôt morphologue, on va dire. La variation, ce n'est pas vraiment un domaine que j'ai beaucoup travaillé, mais évidemment, surtout en travaillant sur une langue comme le grec, hein, j'ai bien, qui est très pluricentrique, j'ai bien pu voir l'importance de la variation. Et c'est vrai que comme je travaille sur l'approche constructionnelle, il y a des questions absolument passionnantes. J'ai vu par exemple que vous avez abordé des questions comme le statut de la variation, merci, comme le statut de la variation dans la grammaire constructionnelle. Qu'est-ce qui est variable, qu'est-ce qui n'est pas variable, etc. Pourquoi c'est variable? Et moi, ça m'intéresse énormément du point de vue de la perception et bien sûr de la production. Donc, je ne suis pas là pour parler de mes intérêts personnels à moi. Je suis plutôt là pour vous remercier, pour remercier Vanessa et Madame. Donc, voilà, merci, qui avait donc co-organisé ce colloque et pour vous assurer encore une fois de notre soutien et de notre joie de voir que dans une équipe pluridisciplinaire, on arrive à avoir un vrai axe linguistique dans lequel plusieurs langues sont représentées et plusieurs langues arrivent à travailler de manière, on va dire, harmonieuse. Voilà, merci beaucoup et bienvenue.
Merci beaucoup, Madeleine. Merci pour ces mots, très gentils. Je voudrais remercier également le soutien du département de portugais. Ça passe plus. Désolée. Voilà, donc je voudrais également remercier le soutien du département d'études lusophones et la directrice du département est là avec nous, Marie-Noëlle Cessia, qui va vous dire également quelques mots.
Bonjour à tous, ce sera très rapide en ce qui me concerne. D'abord, bienvenue et je me réjouis, oui, au nom du département de portugais d'études lusophones de notre université, de cette 4e édition du projet VariaR. C'est un beau projet, un projet qui donne du dynamisme et de la visibilité, un rayonnement d'abord aux études de linguistique du portugais, et à notre département d'études lusophones. Donc, je remercie infiniment Marcia et Vanessa de cette organisation. Et cet être vivant qu'est la langue, qu'est la langue portugaise en particulier, pour ce qui nous intéresse aujourd'hui, mérite toujours et en permanence d'être analysé, observé, commenté. Et pour ce qui est de notre enseignement, il est absolument indispensable justement d'observer cette langue parce qu'elle bouge, et elle doit, et nous devons, nous, dans notre enseignement, ensuite, pouvoir en faire état et montrer l'évolution de la langue et la modernité permanente de la langue portugaise dans toutes ses variantes, variations, variétés, et puisque nous essayons au moins d'enseigner le portugais du Portugal et le portugais du Brésil dans notre département. Il ne s'agit pas seulement d'une seule variation linguistique, mais de plusieurs. Et donc, je me réjouis à nouveau et je remercie infiniment Vanessa pour sa confiance, son efficacité et le travail qu'elle pratique au quotidien et qui se manifeste en particulier aujourd'hui et dans les 2 jours aussi à venir à travers cette manifestation. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Marie-Noëlle. Donc maintenant, je vais passer la parole à Marcia. Mais je voudrais tout d'abord la remercier aussi pour ce partenariat institutionnel entre l'Université Paul Valéry et l'Université fédérale de Rio de Janeiro. Et je voudrais remercier aussi le programme PPG Élèves en particulier pour son aide, son soutien.
Bem, cabe a mim agora a versão de boas-vindas em português, né? Então, é uma alegria receber cada um de vocês nesta quarta edição do Colloque Internacional VariaR, né? Os que estão aqui presencialmente, os que estão acompanhando online ou depois pelo YouTube, né? E os meus destaques neste momento são de agradecimento à UPVM, né, a Universidade Paul Valéry de Montpellier, e ao Grupo Réseau, que recebe o Colóquio, né, esta quarta edição, e os congressistas que aqui estão, pelo apoio financeiro, né, a esse evento, e pela infraestrutura toda aqui. A Vanessa, por todo o trabalho de organização desta quarta edição, aqui na universidade, né? E a monitora Raquel, né, que eu conheci agora, né, que presta assessoria à Vanessa. Ao programa de pós-graduação em Letras Vernáculas da UFRJ, pelo diálogo que temos mantido até em função da minha condição atual de coordenadora do programa de internacionalização do PPG Leve, Vozes Escritas nos Diferentes Espaços da Língua Portuguesa, que é um programa que teve as bases e as rubricas definidas em 2017 pelo professor de literatura brasileira Dalbacho, que também é escritor, né? E depois, em sequência, ele me convidou para continuar coordenando o projeto que estava sob a responsabilidade dele. Eu quero agradecer especialmente ao programa que está representado nesta edição pela professora Violeta Virgínia Rodrigues, que deve estar chegando, se ela não tiver ido para o campus da universidade, em vez de ter vindo para cá, né? Porque ela representa a professora Eliette, que não pôde vir, né? E também alguma participação via CAPES ProEx desse programa nesse evento, tá? Aos estudantes que voluntariamente estão participando deste evento, e aí eu agradeço especialmente às doutorandas Ravena Beatriz Teixeira e Ana Tércia Lacerda, né, que está aqui presente. A Ravena está online, né, bem como aos estudantes graduandos do Instituto de Computação da UFRJ, Pedro Pupolino, que está nesse projeto desde o início, né, ele junto com Morgana, uma outra orientanda minha, estruturaram o site do projeto, né? E o Pedro, né, tem sempre ajudado, tem acompanhado todo o desenvolvimento, né? A todos os debatedores e moderadores nesta edição, porque estão colaborando conosco, né? É um trabalho a mais, então muito obrigada por cada participação, e agora especialmente aos conferencistas, cada um dos conferencistas convidados que colaboram para que, né, as discussões aqui, né, e o próprio andamento das pesquisas a partir de edições como esta, né, possam ser alimentados, né, por novas questões e novas. Thank you very much for being here, Renata Engels and Martin Hilpert. Um evento científico é sempre um espaço de celebração, então que saibamos celebrar uma ciência sociolinguística ou linguística, né, solidária e atenta às demandas, né, de colaboração com o fazer que se manifesta, né, nas exposições de cada trabalho. Cada um tem um rumo aí de pesquisa, né, que sejamos solidários com esses trabalhos que vão ser expostos, e também atenta aos horizontes, né, da pesquisa em si, dos caminhos de investigação. Então, coloque a todos.
Muito obrigada, Márcia. Donc, je vais renforcer en français également mon remerciement pour les conférenciers d'avoir accepté notre invitation à partager leurs travaux avec nous. Nous avons cette année le plaisir d'entendre 5 conférenciers invités, en plus de 8 sessions de communication orale avec 19 présentations en tout. un total de 37 auteurs et co-auteurs, et une séance de lancement de livres dédiée au projet aujourd'hui, plus tard dans la journée. Un grand merci aussi aux membres du projet qui ont pu se déplacer, Carl, Patricia, tous les étudiants qui nous aident à l'organisation de l'événement, Raquel, Natércia, Ravena, Mariana. Muito obrigada para vocês também. Je voudrais remercier aussi aux moniteurs qui nous assistent à distance, Weasley Vilela, pour la partie technique. Natércia aussi va nous aider de ce côté-là. Merci beaucoup. Et je voudrais aussi remercier tout particulièrement les professeurs, enseignants, chercheurs qui ont accepté de faire la modération et d'animer les débats après les présentations. Et aussi, je voudrais remercier le comité scientifique international pour sa participation avant, pendant les conférences. Un grand merci à vous tous. Ici, je voudrais juste vous montrer les statistiques de visite au site du projet. On voit ici qu'on a un public assez international qui s'intéresse à notre projet, comme vous pouvez voir. Et je voudrais dire juste un petit dernier mot sur la publication qui est prévue. On prévoit la publication des travaux présentés au colloque dans un e-book, un libre accès, d'ici la fin 2024. Donc, on enverra toutes les informations à tous qui auront présenté. Et sachant qu'il y a une autre possibilité aussi, si vous préférez, c'est de soumettre vos textes pour le volume 25 de la revue L'Idylle. Il me semble que l'appel à communication, il n'est pas encore en ligne, mais ça ne devrait pas tarder. Ça sera un dossier lié à la thématique des langues pluricentriques, la variation linguistique également. Merci beaucoup. Muito obrigada a todos e bom colóquio. Merci beaucoup. Donc, nous allons passer à la première conférence plénière.
Recording stopped.
Martin.
Recording in progress.
Je vais dire juste quelques mots. So the first plenary lecture will be presented by Martin Hilpert. He hardly needs a presentation and introduction, but so I'll just go to the point. He's a professor of English linguistics at the University of Neuchâtel. He holds a PhD degree from Rice University, and he did a postdoctoral research at the International Computer Science Institute in Berkeley and at the Freiburg Institute for Advanced Studies. He is a specialist in cognitive linguistics, language change construction grammar, of course, and corpus linguistics. The title of his talk today is Contrasting Clips in English and French, a Constructional Perspective. So thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup pour cette introduction. Merci d'être là, tout le monde. Voilà, j'ai préparé cette conférence en anglais. J'espère que ça convient. Mais si jamais vous avez de questions, on peut très, très volontiers discuter en français après. Et après tout, ce thème-là a un lien direct avec les langues latines, avec le français. Voilà, alors je vais switcher maintenant. The topic that I'd like to talk about today is short words, clippings, in English and in French. The research that I'm going to present is joint work. You see the names of my two team members, David Correa Saavedra and Jennifer Rains, who have been working together with me on this topic. And I'd just like to share some of the results that we've obtained with regard to this. So you are all familiar with clipping as a word formation process. I don't need to introduce it at great length. So in English, you have words such as prof, gator, and fridge, which are shortened versions of longer words, professor, alligator. Sure. Okay, am I more in the camera? Okay, great. Right, and one thing that you can see already on the slide, where I've indicated the red parts of the words that are clipped off. Sometimes it's the final part of the word that's missing. Sometimes it's the first part. There are other patterns where material is missing on both sides. So this has been interpreted to mean that clipping is a very unconstrained process, very productive, but also very unpredictable. And that raises the question, well, is it really that anything goes? Or are there tendencies and generalizations that we can infer if we look at lots and lots of data? So when we started on this project, there is a good deal of work on clippings out there, but relatively few studies adopt a quantitative approach where you actually try to look at lots and lots of data and try to infer generalizations in this way. Now, this state of affairs also holds for French. So, for exemple, alors si ça nous arrive que pendant l'après-midi, on a envie de manger un dish avec ses sauces, vous pouvez quand même deviner ce que je veux dire. Alors, pendant l'après-midi, on veut se manger un sandwich avec ses associés. And you see the same pattern. Yeah? There are different ways of shortening words. And this raises the question of any irregularities that we might infer. Okay, so to give you a general idea of what I'll be talking about, our work is really guided by three questions, if you like. So first of all, are there regularities in the way speakers form clippings, or are things as chaotic as they have sometimes been made out to be? And then, of course, we would like to explain when and why speakers clip different word parts. Sometimes there is actually variation, so that the same word can be clipped in different ways. Sometimes we have similar words across different languages that are clipped in different ways. I'll have some examples of that. How can we explain that? Why is it that speakers sometimes do this, and then sometimes they do something else? Right. And then the third question, of course, is, are there systematic differences between English and French? We have two languages that come from different families that have been in contact, of course, but that have different morphological characteristics, different prosodic characteristics, different syntactic characteristics also. How is this reflected in the clippings that we see in the two languages? All right, so in order to approach these questions, David, Jennifer, and I have carried out a research project, which has several parts. Yeah, and I'll take a few minutes to talk about the individual parts before I get to the comparison between English and French. So the first thing that we did is that we constructed large databases of clippings. This actually started during COVID. So if people talk about COVID, I always say, okay, so the first COVID year I spent collecting short words, among other things. Yeah. So we've created a sizable database of clippings in English and in French, 2,000 plus examples for each language. And we have annotated those clippings for a range of different variables. And I'll explain what those variables are. They're concerned with sound, with morphological structure, with meaning, with corpus-based measures of frequency, dispersion, and so on and so forth. That, in a way, is the basis of the analyses that I will present later in this talk, where we look at typical configurations of features. So kinds of clippings, construction types or construction schemas that speakers use when they form new shortened words. All right, I'll say more about this in just a minute. The project also had an experimental component that I won't be talking about today, but I'll be happy to answer questions if you're interested. So we gave people source words and asked them, okay, here are two variants of this word clipped. Do you prefer variant A? Do you prefer variant B? And we then triangulated those results with the observation-based results that we got. Right, and then there's a third component where we turn to corpus data and quite technical methods of distributional semantics in order to investigate meaning differences between clippings and their source words. So, for example, in English, there's the clipping intro from introduction. And well, I can give a linguistics intro course, yeah, and that is an introduction. So there's semantic overlap. But for example, when I talk about an intro to, let's say, a rock song in English, yeah, the guitar intro to Paradise City, Guns N' Roses, that's not a guitar introduction. Right? It would be weird for me to say that's the introduction to Paradise City. And vice versa. If there has been an introduction of new legislation, it would be weird to say that, okay, last year there has been the intro of a new law on taxes or whatever else. Yeah. Okay. If you have questions regarding that, I'll be happy to talk about that too. However, let me get to what I really want to talk about in this talk, namely the contrast between English and French. So I'll start by saying a few words about our database and what we can learn from that database. Then I will present results that show how English and French differ with regard to the clippings that we have in our database. And I'll try and highlight some similarities. There are similarities. There are also differences and explanations for those similarities and differences. And once I'm done with that, I'll try and take a step back and come up with some general ideas that we can conclude from the empirical observations. All right. With that out of the way, I suggest that we get right to it. So what is in our database and what can we learn from it? So our approach toward collecting English and French clippings has been very, very eclectic. On this slide, you see some of the sources that we used. We used published sources. We used surveys. Basically anything that we could get our hands on. So you see, for example, the Oxford English Dictionary has a number of entries that are already marked as shortened. That's very practical. We used that. On Wikipedia, there are several edited lists that people put together. There are websites such as the Urban Dictionary. And then, of course, there is a large body of literature that has investigated clippings. And we tried to make use of all of that. And then, of course, we also recruited speakers of French and English just to give us short words that they have in their daily repertoire. Yeah. Okay. I like to point out that we looked at all of this with a critical perspective, so we didn't take everything. We also excluded things like names, for instance. So shortened names like Betty for Elizabeth or something like that. We focused on words, not names. And we also excluded elements that were simultaneously shortened and augmented, for example, with a diminutive. Yeah. So for example, in English, husband is turned into a hubby, Yeah, and so there's shortening going on, but also augmentation. And we decided to just have shortenings. I'll be happy to explain the whys and wherefores of this, but I just wanted to be transparent about this. All right. So about 2,000 and a couple more for each language. But then we annotated those clippings in order to find out what their characteristics really are. So let me show you a few graphs that capture some of the annotations that we did, starting with just the length of clippings that we have. So in this graph, you see French on the left-hand side, English on the right-hand side, and the length of the bars indicate the number of types that we have. And you already see an interesting asymmetry between French and English. Yeah? So in English, it's the monosyllabic clippings that form the greatest proportion of our types. And in French, it's the disyllabic ones. Yeah? Well, interestingly, there are words, for example, so in English, an amplifier is shortened to amp, and in French, ampli. Yeah? So there are these asymmetries that account for the patterns that we see here. A little less pronounced, but still worth mentioning, is that French has a stronger relative preference for clippings that have 3 syllables, something like toxico. You don't find that all that much in English, at least if you compare it to monosyllabic and disyllabic clippings. Yeah, and of course, clippings that are longer than 3 syllables, generally quite rare. Yeah, so they are there, but there we quite often find forms that are, well, maybe shortened forms of compounds, where each component of the compound is reduced to a monosyllabic or disyllabic clipping. All right. What else? So I introduced my presentation with examples of clippings where material is missing in different parts of the word. And this is actually what you see here. Now, both languages converge on a predominance of end clippings, so that the word final material is left out of the word. Why is this so? Well, it just makes sense from a perceptual perspective. So for human speakers, it is much easier to recover a source word when we hear the beginning of it. Yeah, so the information value is much higher than what we would have if the first part of a word is missing. There are these so-called front clippings, so a burger instead of a hamburger. Yeah, that exists, but in relative terms, it's of course much less frequent. Yeah? And then there are other minor types, like for example, in English, there are clippings such as specs for spectacles or deets for details, where, well, I'll say more about this rather special type in a second. But you see that that type, for example, is almost absent in French. Yeah? Both French and English have what we call middle and end clippings. So, for example, def sup in French corresponds to formations like rom-com in English. So that's an infrequent but still very typical type. Yeah? I'll talk about this in a second. Right. Morphology. The morphological structure of words is a crucial variable we have found. And we make a distinction here between 3 different types, and I'll maybe start at the bottom because that's the easiest distinction. There are some clippings where the part that remains is actually a full word. So if people talk about the States rather than the United States, what stays is a word. there are words such as club for nightclub or step for stepsister. So, well, you see what I want to say there. In the middle, we have clippings where the truncation or the cut aligns with a morpheme boundary. Yeah? So for example, in microphone, if what's left is micro, well, micro is a morpheme, can be analyzed as a morpheme. And so these clipping types we would analyze as morphemic clippings. And then at the top, you see the most frequent clipping type. The label that we have for it, it's not really ideal, but we went for it nonetheless. Submorphemic. What do we mean by that? What we mean by that is that the clipping cuts into a morpheme. Yeah? So the clipping doesn't align with a morpheme boundary, but rather we're left with what is essentially a part of a morpheme, or not even a morpheme. Okay, and this is the case, for example, in info from information, or in prof from professor, well, submorphemic clippings. All right. When you look at this graph, there is something of an imbalance between the morphemic type and the word-based type. So French has relatively more morphemic clippings and relatively fewer word clippings. Yeah, so you see that in English, it's roughly 50-50. There is a slight difference, but same order of magnitude. Whereas in French, we have about 3 times as many morphemic clippings as word clippings, and that, well, that's a substantial difference. Right. What else? Of course, sound plays a huge role. Now, both segmental phonology and suprasegmental phonology. Have to do a little parenthesis here. In English, word stress is a major determinant of clipping. In French, less so. I'm not talking about stress at all in this talk because I want to compare the same variables across the 2 languages. Yeah? So keep that in mind when I present our results. Right. What can we say about the final segments here? Well, in both languages, final consonants are the most frequent variant, the most frequent option, followed by vowels, followed by consonant clusters. And, well, again, we see a marked asymmetry between English and French. French has a much higher relative frequency of final vowels. Yeah? And that actually squares with the French preference for disyllabic clippings. Come to that in a minute. Disyllabic clippings have a tendency to be vowel final. Monosyllabic clippings have a tendency to be consonant final. And there's a reason for that. Okay. And then, English, relatively speaking, has lots and lots more final consonant clusters than French. Yeah? So if you compare the lowest bar there, about 3.5 times as many consonant clusters in English as compared to French. And if you put together the clusters and the final consonants, in English, we have something like north of 80% of the clippings that we find are actually consonant final. Yeah? So that is huge. And in French, the relation is, well, not quite 50-50, but more something like 60-40 if we add it all together. Okay, there are 2 more, so bear with me. Compounds. We were interested in the question whether compound source words behave differently than other source words. So for example, well, babyfoot. If that is clipped to baby in French, yeah, we have a compound, and this will be one of those cases where the remaining part actually is an entire word. Yeah. Not so in info from information or prof from professor. Right. And this is the last variable that I want to mention at this point, which is an overview of the parts of speech that are represented in our database. And well, this graph looks a little special. It looks like a T because there is one type that overwhelmingly constitutes the majority of our types. That would be nouns. So yes, clippings in both French and English have a substantial noun bias. And this has been stated, so this aligns very well with findings of earlier studies that have looked and tried to quantify variation in clippings. But here we see it come out very, very clearly. Huh? Okay, aside from nouns, we do find all the other parts of speech. They are there. Yeah? So it is possible to have adjectives, deg, or perso, so adjectives and adverbs. Verbs generally are fairly infrequent because of their inflectional characteristics. It's harder to clip verbs rather than nouns. But these things exist. Again, French a little more than English. You see that we have one type here in the graph that is ambiguous. So for example, for bisexual, there are many contexts where this could be either a noun or an adjective. And we sort of had a choice. Do we want to count two types, so to speak? Yeah. Do we want to have one bi that we count as noun and one bi that we count as adjective? Or do we want to say, okay, it's one word, it has two syntactic characteristics? We went with what we thought was the more prudent way of annotating this to have ambiguous categories. Okay, right. Let me give you an overview of what I've been saying so far. I've presented to you 6 variables that we have annotated in the clipping database. These variables, they capture phonological characteristics, they capture aspects of morphology, they capture word classes, and as such, they allow us to characterize our clippings in really precise terms, distinguishing different types of clippings that speakers produce. We actually do have a number of further variables in the database that I'm not going to talk about today. I just want to mention them so that you have an impression. So these variables include, among other things, whether there's a sound difference between a clipping and a source word. So think brother, bro, so the vowel is different. We also annotated for the semantic domain of the clipping. So we had an annotation scheme with different semantic categories, like things from science, things related to animals, things related to drug use or computer gaming, things like that. We have a whole range of frequency-based variables. For example, the normalized frequency of the form of the clipping, how often do we find it, the orthographic neighborhood density of the clipping, the dispersion of the clipping in corpus data, so how regular the intervals are with which we can find the clipping in corpus data, and then things like the number of word types that contain the clipping as a substring. So let's say we have a clipping sub. How many words are there that begin with sub? Submarine, subordinate, and so on and so forth. Yeah. Okay. Now, I'll be happy to answer questions about these variables, but for the purposes of this talk, I'd like to limit myself to the 6 that you have seen. What do we want to do with these variables? So earlier quantitative studies of clipping have adopted techniques like, for example, logistic regression, where people try to find out, okay, is it more likely that somebody will take the source word and make a front clipping or an end clipping out of it? Yeah. regression techniques can identify the variables that play a role with regard to these processes. And that's great, but our approach is a little different. So we adopt a tool that essentially involves the cross-tabulation of variables, and that allows us to see whether there are certain configurations of features that occur more often than we would expect by chance. Let me explain this, giving you a few examples. Yeah. Right. One variable that I talked about is the part of the source word that is clipped off. So let's take the distinction between end clipping and front clipping. So do we have something like prof from professor, or do we have something like burger from hamburger? Yeah, front clipping versus end clipping. And there's a second variable that I talked about, which is the distinction between the submorphemic clippings and morpheme clippings and word clippings. So is the clipping a whole word, such as baby from baby foot? Is it a morpheme, such as micro, or is it a submorphemic unit, such as prof? Now, we can look at these two variables and put them together and cross-tabulate them to see whether there are any patterns that jump out at us. Yeah? And with our database, we can actually do that very easily, and we can see patterns in our data. So let me show you this table here. What you see here is a cross-tabulation of the two variables. Yeah? So position of the clipping, morphemic status of the clipping. And in the cells, you see the frequencies of how many clippings we observe. Now, those are the first values that you see. And then in the brackets, you have the values that we would expect by chance. Now, so just given the general frequency of end clippings, and given the general frequency of submorphemic, morphemic, and word clippings, how many types would we expect in each cell? Yeah. And so this is the kind of table that you could use to run a chi-square test, for example. But really, all that I'm interested in here is just the difference between observed and expected frequencies, which don't require you to do any kind of inferential statistics to begin with. It's just that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, expected given the general frequency of the different types that we have. So, in English, end clippings are the most frequent type. Yeah. So we have something like 80% end clippings. So we would expect the first row here to add up to roughly 80% of the data. Now, we also have about 80% submorphemic clippings. So that means that this cell here should have lots and lots more examples than, for example, let's say this one here, middle and end clipping, that is a full word. So that really just takes into account the proportions of these different types in the rows and the proportions of the different types in the column. Right. Thanks for asking the question. I'm sure that lots of you had the same question, but we're afraid to ask. So that's great. Okay. But I don't want to torture you with the numbers unnecessarily. I want to give you some examples. And here I've highlighted in the table cells that are overpopulated, where we find more examples than we would expect by chance. For example, if we look at morphemic clippings that are end clippings, we see that we find more of them than we would expect by chance. So in our database, we have 325 English clippings of this kind. We would expect only 280. So an example for that would be paleo, short for paleo diet. So that's only when when you're only allowed to eat meat, basically. No vegetables, or maybe salad. Okay, so more examples of this kind that we would expect. And you see that the two other categories are underrepresented. So we find fewer examples than what we have in the brackets. Okay, if we go down one line here, so front clipping. In front clipping, we have word clippings that are overrepresented. So if you're talking about the nightclub and you just say, yeah, we're heading out to the club, that's this particular cell, which is overrepresented. Why is it overrepresented? Well, if you have a compound like nightclub, the right-hand element is the head, is the more informative element. And so it actually makes sense to clip off the first part rather than the second part. So there's a motivation that this cell is overpopulated rather than the other two. And then going down 2 rows further, we have the middle and end clippings that I already mentioned. So rom-com for romantic comedy. We find more of these forms than we would expect by chance. Okay, so this is the basic logic of our analysis of the data that we have. We look for configurations of variables. We look for cells that are overrepresented, and we try to think about why it might be that these cells are overrepresented in the way that they are. Okay, I want to give you just one more example of this to illustrate how it works. So we start with the same variable that we've looked at before, the position of the clip part, so end clipping and front clipping. And we try and cross-tabulate that with a phonological variable, where we have a final vowel, a final consonant, or a final cluster. So doing that, we can ask whether end clipping is relatively more likely to produce clippings that end in a vowel rather than consonants. Okay, what do we find? Again, we have a table like this, and gonna jump right to the cells that are overrepresented. Well, what we see is that here I want to start with middle clippings. Well, so things like stats from statistics, or gents. So that's pluralized gent, and nugs for nuggets. Those are middle clippings, and they commonly end in a cluster, well, simply because they have a plural ending to them. So that they're like a consonant final clipping that is pluralized, that has the additional S, and that makes a consonant cluster in English. If we move on to the front clippings, so things like quake for earthquake or shroom for mushroom, they have a higher than chance probability of ending in a consonant. So we find more consonant final front clippings than we would theoretically expect. Why is that the case? Well, it makes sense from a perceptual perspective. If we have a front clipping, we are at a disadvantage. The first part of the word is missing. That makes the clipping hard to identify. So the least we can do as a speaker is to add a final consonant that adds more information to the signal. So in relative terms, if we have an end clipping, well, we have the beginning of the word that gives us a strong cue. So we might get away with not adding a final consonant or a cluster, even though here you see that it's overrepresented. But you see that, well, if you compare the 3 cells of end clippings, it's actually the case that final vowels are overrepresented. So things like dino or limo are end clippings that we find more often than we would theoretically expect. All right, so that's the basic logic. There's one more nuance or slight complication that I need to mention, namely that the analysis that we're applying can not just cross-tabulate 2 variables, but rather we're cross-tabulating all 6 of them, okay? That is hard to imagine for a human being. Yeah, we can imagine a table that has 2 dimensions. We can maybe also imagine a cube that has 3 dimensions, but then we go into 4 and 5 and 6 dimensions. And if I'm a visual thinker, so at that point, my screen goes black, and I have to rely on some physics people that can easily imagine these sorts of things, multidimensional spaces. A computer can do these kinds of things, luckily. Yeah? So all of these variables are cross-tabulated with each other, and we have for each possible configuration here a likelihood that is assigned to that configuration based on the relative frequencies of each level in each variable. Again, no need to go into the gory details of how this works, but the general logic is actually, even I can understand. So let me try and explain. Let's suppose that we have a clipping that is 1 syllable in length, that is an end clipping, that is submorphemic, ends in a consonant, is not derived from a compound, but rather from a simple word, and that is a noun. Noun is its part of speech. So we can look at our database and say, all right, so monosyllabic clippings, quite a few in our database, end clippings, also quite a few, submorphemic, quite a few. Consonants, how many do we have, opposed to consonant clusters and vowels? How many non-compound source words? How many nouns? And on the basis of that, we can calculate an expected frequency for this particular configuration. And we can compare how many types we find to that expected frequency. So just to give you an example of what kind of clipping this would be, for example, croc from crocodile. Yeah? Actually a very, very typical kind of clipping in English. 1 syllable, final consonant from a noun, etc. Yeah. Okay. The big question is, how many croc type clippings do we find in the database, and how many would we expect? Well, we observe more than 400. We'd expect statistically just 200. So this happens more often than we would theoretically expect. Right. Now, with this in mind, I would like to come to the application of this technique. This allows us to address the question what the similarities and differences between English and French are. So just to remind you, what we do is that we run an analysis where the input is the database with the annotation of these variables. And there is actually a 7th variable that captures the difference between English and French. So for each clipping, we know whether it is a French word or an English word. It's just that we combine all the data in one data set and then run the analysis in one fell swoop. Okay, and with that, we can actually answer the following question. So first, are there clipping configurations that are shared, that are the same across both languages? Are there configurations that are language specific? Are there maybe asymmetries so that something that is preferred in English happens less often than expected in French, or vice versa? Yeah? Okay, let's look at some results. I want to start with shared preferences and dispreferences. And this brings me right back to croc, which is preferred in English, but also in French. Yeah? So monosyllabic consonant final clippings we find more often than expected. The trend is stronger in English than in French. Yeah? So you see that in both English and French, we expect around 200 of these. In English, we find more than 400. In French, we find, well, almost 350. So that is still judged as highly significant by the analysis. So in English, we have forms like croc. In French, we have forms such as prof or dem for démission. And generally, there are lots of these. Now, why do we find lots of these? They hit a sweet spot perceptually. One syllable, that's very short, but it has the final consonant. It is the first part of the word that we get. So they're easy to identify. From the speaker perspective, they're easy to produce. So it's kind of a match that is made in, well, don't want to say made in heaven, but you know, it's something that works well, and that's why we see it a lot. Right. There's another shared tendency across French and English. So there are disyllabic clippings that end in a vowel, things like klepto. And there's another subtlety here, namely that what's shared is that the clippings are morphemic. So klepto and kleptomaniac means something, chemo and chemotherapy means something, multi and multinational means something. So we find lots and lots of these. All right, so far, so expected maybe. But there are also types that are maybe a little more original. So, for example, the rom-com type, I thought would be a quirk of the English language. It's not. Yeah? We will also find it in French. Now, when you look at the observed and expected frequencies, you see that it's not a very frequent type in the database at all. Yeah? We just find 30 examples in English, 20 in French. That's not much in absolute terms. But when we compare that to what we would expect, theoretically, it's a factor 10 or more higher. Yeah? So we have these middle and end clippings, like def sup, rom-com, etc. Okay. What about shared dispreferences? Are there things that are underrepresented in both English and French? The answer is yes. Yeah? And what's maybe good to note here is that, well, here we have clippings that do exist, that are used, that are frequent, that are reasonably entrenched in speakers' minds, but that as a group appear less often than we would expect. So something like psi, we do find it, yeah. And in English, you find things like Q for cucumber or D for detective. It's possible, it's just not preferred. So we observe a lot fewer types than we would expect by chance, given how often we have vowel final clippings that are end clippings, are submorphemic, and so on and so forth. All right. Now, why are these dispreferred? It's kind of the mirror image of the consonant final monosyllabic clippings. Here, the missing consonant at the end is a detriment to recovering the source word. So Q for cucumber is not quite enough of a signal to let you know what you're really talking about. Okay. So much for the shared features. I want to talk a little bit about language-specific preferences and dispreference, starting with the French clippings. So here, a first type that I'd like to mention is hebdo, similar to klepto, but hebdo is submorphemic rather than morphemic. Okay, and so hebdo cuts into a morpheme boundary. Same for cine and resto. French loves this. We find more than double the amount that we would expect by chance. English is kind of meh about this. Yeah? So we observe close to 100. We expect a bit more than 100, but there is no significant preference that English has for this kind of type. So it's a French specificity. Another French specificity are these 3-syllable clippings that I've already mentioned. So something like toxico, obibio, magneto. These things, again, they're not super frequent, yeah, but the observed expected ratio is, again, something like 10 to 1. that is very different from what we find in English, where the observed frequencies are just double of what they are compared to the expected. And given that the frequencies are relatively low, the analysis tells us, look, this could be something, but we're not sure. Okay. My favorite, douche. So I went into the analysis thinking that, yeah, we're going to have to talk about douche at some point. And I was so sure that it would be a preferred type. It's not. So why is it not? Let me talk about this. So we're talking about compound source words. Deux chevaux, sous-marin, défaut de paiement. And the clipping converges to the actually preferable form of one syllable with a final consonant. Okay. Still, in French, we observe a fraction of what we would expect, and English is actually above that, yeah, but the tendency doesn't come out as significant. Right. So this was a little surprising to me. Okay. With that in mind, let me move on to English. I'm watching the time here. So we've actually published some results on English already in 2023. So what I'm saying here partly goes back to that. If you're interested, there's an article, it's open access, you can download it. And one thing that we found was this specs type, which is monosyllabic, has this middle clipping feature so that spectacles is reduced to specs, circumstances is reduced to circs, nuggets is reduced to nugs, and of course you see the role of the plural morpheme s in this clipping type, which results in the final cluster that is the characteristical hallmark of this type. Now, of course, in French, the plural is typically silent, so we don't find this particular configuration. You see that there are two examples of this in the French database as a whole. This is also what we would expect. The analysis tells us, well, we can't really say if there's anything going on there, but in English, it's definitely something that exists. Then, English has a dispreference for words that would actually strike you as normal English clipping. So things like rehab or intel or admin. Yeah? Those words exist. It's just that if we look at their type frequency, we find fewer of those guys than we would actually expect. So in English, we just find about 70 in our database. We would expect double that. In French, we actually do find more or less what we would expect. Yeah? So two-syllable clippings that are end-clipped, that cut into a morpheme boundary, that have a final consonant, not derived from a compound, and noun as a part of speech. Well, we find fewer of these in English than we would expect. Right. So to give you a very general conclusion from this part of the talk, our analysis of a large database of English and French clippings reveals that there are some interesting tendencies. There are a number of configurations that we see more often than we would expect. There are a number of configurations that we see less often than we would expect. And we see some shared tendencies across the two languages, despite the differences that exist between those languages. Right. What do we make of all of this? Let me come to a short final section of my talk here. So my way of thinking about this goes along the lines of construction grammar. I think that we can imagine these clipping types as networks of constructions that share certain features and that are entrenched to different degrees in the linguistic knowledge of the speakers. And we can visualize this as a kind of network such as the one that you see on this slide, which represents overrepresented and underrepresented configurations in English. So for example, You see rom-com here. You see the klepto type that I talked about. Wait a second. You see croc. So the size of the bubbles represents the frequency. How many of these guys do we find in our database? Color represents overrepresentation and underrepresentation. Yeah? So for example, Q from cucumber, underrepresented. We do find a fair number of types, but still fewer than we would expect. Still worse is re from reinsurance. Difference being that here we have a morphemic clipping rather than a submorphemic clipping. Right. So one thing that you see in this network, I should talk about the edges or the links. There are links between types if they share features. So for example, here we see types together that are monosyllabic. Yeah? So each clipping type that just consists of one syllable, they're connected through a link. If two clipping types are disyllabic, or if they are based on compounds, they are linked through a network. If there are many links, that means that there are many features that are shared by the different types. Okay, there are lots of things that I could point out about this network, but I'm looking at the time, and I also want to have a quick look at the corresponding network in French. So here we have it. You see the preferred types, the dispreferred types. There are some general tendencies, such as the avoidance of monosyllabic vowel final types. So psy is dispreferred. Zo from zoology is dispreferred. As in English, the admin type is underrepresented. And the general idea here would be that speakers have knowledge of these types. And when there is an opportunity to form a new clipping, they would resort to the inventory that they already have. And they will match their existing experience of clippings with the problem at hand, where they have to clip a source word in a certain way. And they will use patterns that are already well established in their repertoire. This brings me again to our experimental studies where we have tested this. Yeah? And it turns out that we can make predictions that then line up with the answers that people give in an experimental setting. Let me come to an end. So in general terms, I hope to have illustrated some parallels and differences between clippings in English and French. In both languages, clipping is very productive, very frequent, something that is done all the time. So just for the little anecdote, I wasn't sure how clipping would shake out in French. But since 2020, I've been very much involved in French-speaking university administration. And I've never seen more instances of acronyms, clippings, and other hardly understandable word types. So that was a rich source of examples, kind of secondary use, but still. So both languages, clipping really works abundantly, and we find similar variables that are at play concerning the length, the segmental phonology, the morphology, the parts of speech. There are some strong parallels, but also some differences that we would have to look at in closer detail, also taking into account the language-specific characteristics that I haven't really talked about very much in this talk, like stress in English and other segmental phonology related variables that are relevant in French. Right. So I've already mentioned the similarities and differences. I'm summarizing them here. But I want to come to some general observations that I think we can take away from the data. So I've mentioned at several points during the talk that clippings are optimized for recoverability. So the overrepresented types that we see are supposed to make it easy for the speaker and for the hearer. And there's a trade-off, obviously, yeah. We find that clippings of different lengths differ in their phonological and morphological characteristics. And maybe most importantly, there's not just one way of doing it. Yeah? So I don't think that there's a single clipping schema, but rather there are different types, different schemas that speakers orient to when they form new clippings. So that would be the idea of a constructional network where there are, well, tendencies that converge, but still specificities at different levels of granularity. So that some of these types are identical or highly similar across English and French, and others are language specific. And with that, I'd really like to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Recording stopped.
Je ne sais pas si ça marche. Ah si.
Ça marche.
Thank you very much for this presentation. We now open the floor to discussion, to questions. Does anyone has questions?
Yes, so
En français.
no, let me speak English. You speak English. Yes, this is very, very interesting. So my question was, you said that you have run a forced choice experiment. This is, of course, one of the things that, to my opinion, you should do in order to have measures. And my question was it a chronometric experiment, or was it just a yes
arriver jusqu'à nous, il va arriver plus tard que prévu. Donc, nous allons inverser deux conférences et nous allons écouter Patricia de Ramos, qui est de l'université de Augsbourg en Allemagne, qui devait parler cet après-midi et qui va donc intervertir avec Conrad sa présentation de façon à simplifier un petit peu l'organisation. Donc, voilà, Patricia de Ramos de Augsbourg va parler en portugais et sa conférence, pardon, s'intitule Os controladores de contacto expressivo, apelativo e fático em uma comunidade de contato linguístico hispano-luso no Nordeste argentino. Tout un programme. Voilà, merci à vous.
Bom, merci. Muito obrigada mais uma vez pelo convite. Eu amo estar aqui e hoje eu vou falar de um tema que não é o meu tema de pesquisa principal, é um tema que surge do corpus que eu uso para minha tese de doutorado, que são esses marcadores, né, esses controladores. Como eu só tenho 20 minutos, não é, Vanessa? Então, a minha fala vai ser um pouco curta, espero, porque eu quero mostrar os exemplos. Essa é a estrutura, vou falar dos controladores, o objetivo e perguntas, marco teórico, vou apresentar brevemente o meu corpo e parto rapidamente aos resultados, à discussão. Bom, então, os controladores é um tema, para mim, que eu não tinha na minha órbita, mas, segundo os especialistas, as pessoas que estudam esses tipos de marcador do discurso, são marcadores que também são conhecidos como apêndice de confirmação ou apelação, perguntas de confirmação ou tag question, and I think that's because of the from English. E os controladores de contato expressivo, apelativo e fático, que é a perspectiva do grupo Valesco, da Espanha, e também do Antônio Bris, que é um espanhol que estuda muito os marcadores do discurso. Justamente, Antônio Bris fala que esse tipo de controlador ou esse tipo de marcador do discurso são metadiscursivos, são marcas que manifestam a relação entre os participantes, mas também da relação dos participantes com relação ao enunciado, ou ao seu enunciado. Então, o Bris também fala que a função predominante desse tipo de marcador é a intenção de influir no receptor. Então, ele tem essa função primária e também fática, que é a função de manter a comunicação durante a interação, né? E, claro, ele se concretiza no uso, e o meu corpus é oral, então eu vou falar aqui principalmente da oralidade, e ele é usado para uma reafirmação, autorreafirmação ou justificação do eu, da sua atuação também, de como ele se sente, de como ele percebe e daquilo que foi dito, falado. Bom, as formas mais encontradas, as formas mais descritas são essas aqui. No, sabes, entiendes, verdade? Te lo digo e oye, que são as formas que descreve o Bris. E Sestero encontra outras também, mas a gente percebe que a maioria estão na segunda pessoa. Então, por exemplo, no crees, ou de acordo, ou vale. Bom, vale aqui é uma partícula que eu não encontro no meu corpus. E do que dependem, né? Como a gente pode estudar esse tipo de marcador? Então, o Bris, ele fala que dependem de várias, por exemplo, a ênfase na pronúncia, características lexicais, a posição, ou seja, ela está no começo do enunciado, no meio ou no final, e aí a gente tem que ver o que a gente entende por posição aqui. Também de marcas prosódicas e o grau de implicação do ouvinte. Eu não sou, então eu não vou falar de prosódia, mas em alguns exemplos eu faço uma breve uma anotação, Ah, mas aí aqui passa, e aqui pelo visto está passando também. Tá bom. Bom, aqui a Cesteiro, ela divide esses marcadores em 3 grupos, que eu não vou me aprofundar aqui, mas depois a gente pode voltar. É só mais uma aproximação teórica, diferente da do Bris um pouquinho, que há autores que divergem um pouco na análise. Então, tem autores que, claro, dependendo do marco teórico, né? Bom, quais são os meus objetivos, então, aqui na minha apresentação de hoje? Então, eu procuro analisar somente qualitativamente hoje, porque eu não fiz ainda uma análise quantitativa, mas vale a pena fazer, de interações semidirigidas, a fim de estabelecer as variantes empregadas pelos falantes na região de haverá missões e buscar descrever como funcionam a partir da proposta de análise de conversação, justamente de Bris e o grupo Valesco. Quais são minhas perguntas? Bom, quais são as formas encontradas? Que função exercem? E eu me pergunto se cada forma possui uma ou mais de uma função. E do que depende, né? De que depende essa, eh, essa função? E aí eu acho interessante perguntar, justamente, tomando a proposta de análise da conversação de Bris e do grupo Valesco e também de Pons Borderia, o que significa posição? Com relação a que unidade a gente consideramos que o marcador ocupa a posição inicial, interior ou final, né? Quais são essas qual é a perspectiva? E aí o grupo Valesco propõe a seguinte hipótese: a variação funcional dos marcadores do discurso se encontra limitada por sua posição discursiva e pelo tipo de unidade na qual se integra, e eu compartilho essa hipótese depois de analisar brevemente o meu corpus. E aí, esses autores dizem que o ponto de partida se situa no eixo entre o dialógico e o monológico, diferenciando assim a unidade máxima, monológica, que é a intervenção, e a unidade mínima, que é a mínima dialógica, que é o intercâmbio. E aí o interessante é ver que cada turno de fala é uma intervenção, mas nem toda intervenção é um turno de fala. Por quê? Porque pode haver uma intervenção que não é aceita pelo interlocutor, então ele não é considerado um turno de fala, né? Então, o turno de fala é social e a intervenção ela é estrutural. Então, o limite das intervenções dialógicas é constituída por uma intervenção turno só iniciativa acima e uma intervenção só reativa abaixo. O que eu
C'est bon, c'est plein écran, c'est bon. Et puis, on peut tout de suite passer au deuxième. Au deuxième. Oups. Ah oui. Voilà. Parfait. Et il est parti? Il est parti de nouveau?
Oh, mais c'est...
Oh.
Ah. On touche à rien, juste à la petite... Non, ça repart.
Ah, c'est un mauvais.
Voilà.
Ah, non.
Voilà, bon. Il faut relancer le diaporama. Oui, ou de la diapositive actuelle. C'est celle-là. Il faut relancer le... Ici, là, avec
Non, mais là, c'est bon. Là,
non,
c'est
mais
bon.
c'est pas un grand écran. Avec la souris, vous mettez-vous là. Voilà. Ça devrait être bon, là. Voilà.
Ah.
Ici, c'est parfait.
Ouf. Bon.
Voilà.
Alors, bonjour à tous
Recording in progress.
et à toutes. Tout d'abord, je tiens à remercier les organisatrices de ce merveilleux colloque, 4e édition, Vanessa Meireles et Márcia Vieira. Et c'est toujours un plaisir d'être là parmi vous, surtout qu'en 4 éditions, c'est la 3e où je suis présente. Et donc, voilà, je deviens une habituée. Bien. Alors, lors des derniers événements, j'ai beaucoup parlé du laboratoire d'études romanes de l'Université Paris 8 et en particulier des travaux de l'axe 2, dynamique, innovation et variation dans les langues romanes. Aujourd'hui, je vais me limiter à parler un peu de l'alternance et variation morphologique et morphosyntaxique en terminologie, donc dans les vocabulaires de spécialité, et puis la place de la description de la morphologie dans l'Observatoire des langues romanes en spécialité. Donc, notre laboratoire, c'est dédié, disons, au langage scientifique et technique, non des sciences dures, mais des sciences molles. Donc, les sciences sociales et humaines, en particulier celles qui se dédient au travail, le droit du travail, la sociologie du travail, l'ergonomie, etc. Donc, le droit, l'économie, les finances, c'est-à-dire tous les domaines qui, en fait, sont enseignés dans le cadre de la filière langues étrangères appliquées. Et c'est dans ce sens que nous développons cette branche de recherche depuis que je suis arrivée à Paris 8 en tant que maître de conférence en 1996. Donc, ça fait déjà un bon moment. Et là, voilà, c'est le résultat de ces années de travail. Et en fait, le projet a eu plusieurs noms, comme c'est d'habitude. Et là, c'est l'Observatoire de langue romane en spécialité. Alors, je commencerai par parler un peu de la formation des termes qui relèvent de la compétence et du génie de la langue. Je vais me consacrer en particulier à la composition syntagmatique en terminologie dans les vocabulaires de spécialité et un peu aux matrices terminogéniques dans les sciences sociales et humaines du travail. Je présenterai juste quelques données Et je tiens à signaler dès le début, en fait, qu'il s'agit d'une toute petite composante de l'observatoire. Donc là, je vais focaliser sur la composition et sur les matrices terminogéniques. Voilà. Alors, on appelle souvent procédés lexicogéniques les procédés de formation des unités du lexique général et on appelle procédés terminogéniques les procédés de formation des unités terminologiques, c'est-à-dire des unités a exactement les mêmes comportements ou les mêmes tendances que dans les sciences dites molles. Moi, je travaille avec les sciences molles. Connaître donc les règles de formation du lexique et maîtriser le génie de la langue, pour utiliser un terme qui était très cher à Darmesteter, sont donc des conditions indispensables à tout travail terminologique. Alors, quant à la formation encore des termes et quant à la compétence et au génie de la langue, nous pouvons dire encore que les termes sont construits à partir des formants appartenant au système morphologique de chaque langue et ils respectent généralement les types de structures offerts par le système, présentent les mêmes ressources de formation que les mots de la langue générale et se soumettent également aux mêmes règles de combinaison et de restriction. Toutefois, les unités terminologiques présentent des spécificités morphologiques dues non pas au système de la langue, mais au système de connaissances auquel elles sont liées. Et donc, c'est là où, en fait, le comportement change. Alors, examinons donc de plus près certaines particularités morphologiques des terminologies, notamment sur le plan de la composition syntagmatique. Donc, je restreins, bien entendu, le sujet, même si je pouvais parler des heures, bien entendu, mais là, je me limite à la composition syntagmatique. Alors, les langues, je voulais encore dire que la structure des unités terminologiques ne présente apparemment pas de différence générale par rapport au mode du lexique général, à l'exception d'une fréquence plus grande de certains types formels. Ça aussi, c'est important. Dans les langues de spécialité, nous avons une plus forte fréquence de sigles, de termes comportant des formants savants, grec et latin, bien entendu, pour les sciences de la santé, etc., ou pour le domaine juridique, composition syntagmatique, etc. Mais là, nous parlons de tendance, plutôt. Et selon les résultats de plusieurs travaux à dominante statistique, il est possible de dire que le degré d'utilisation de certains formants ou de certains procédés de formation des termes, il est plus élevé dans un tel domaine que dans un autre. Voilà ce qui est possible de prédire. Mais en règle générale, ils sont construits à partir des formants appartenant au système morphologique de chaque langue, à l'exception des entrants. On va mettre de côté. Ainsi, ils respectent les types de structures offerts par le système, présentent les mêmes ressources de formation que les mots de la langue générale et se soumettent donc aux mêmes règles de combinaison et de restriction. Alors, les langues romanes utilisent des séquences dénominatives telles que accident du travail, agent de l'audit, école des relations humaines, politique de rémunération globale, en português, acidente do trabalho, agente da auditoria, escola das relações humanas, política de remuneração global, etc. Et pour Darmesteter, je reviens au fondateur de la morphologie en France, probablement le premier linguiste de l'école française à les aborder, ces compositions syntagmatiques. Ces expressions ne sont pas des composés, mais des juxtaposés. Ça fait couler beaucoup d'encre. Je ne vais pas m'allonger sur la question. Alors, pour Émile Benveniste, qui fait avancer la connaissance par rapport à ces unités, entre le mot et le syntagme, nous avons des synapsies, donc, et c'est un terme qui est revenu, disons, à la mode dans les études morphologiques contemporaines en France. Et un terme repris et très cher à Jean-François Sableron. Ces exemples montrent bien qu'il s'agit donc de noms d'objets ou de noms de notions ou noms de concepts, comme par exemple avion à réaction. Et à partir de là, leur analyse pour le français est devenue progressivement autonome par rapport aux locutions verbales, adjectivales ou adverbiales, autrement dit, par rapport à la phraséologie proprement dite. Distinction qui en fait était complètement inexistante chez Darmesteter. Louis Gilbert travaille sur des expressions comparables, mais ayant une structure syntaxique différente du type nom plus adj, du type donc charge sociale, encargos sociais, qu'il appelle donc composé syntagmatique. Et d'après les exemples de Benveniste et Gilbert, il s'agit toujours d'expressions nominales destinées à répertorier les objets concrets ou non du monde et dans la plupart du monde des connaissances scientifiques et techniques. Donc, il s'agit normalement d'expressions figées ou semi-figées. Elles peuvent avoir, bien entendu, différents degrés de figement et l'ordre des éléments ne peut pas normalement être inversé. Charge sociale, administration bureaucratique, etc. Il existe bien d'autres façons de nommer ce phénomène linguistique, comme groupe lexical, unité de signification, dépendant donc de la perspective et des approches. Et aujourd'hui, en terminologie, on parle de polytermes. Moi, personnellement, je ne parle pas de polytermes. Je n'aime pas du tout cette acception. Je parle toujours de syntagme terminologique. Un exemple extrême de ce type de composition syntagmatique qu'on peut trouver, bien entendu, dans les textes et les discours des sciences sociales et humaines, c'est par exemple modèle de planification des ressources humaines dans le flux du personnel. Modelo de planeamento dos recursos humanos no fluxo do pessoal. Or, là, c'est limite, bien entendu. Ça commence à casser l'unité et donc à devenir la langue à l'œuvre et à échapper à l'unité de signification, donc au concept auquel un terme doit correspondre. Alors, un exemple comme celui-là, il est formé de 3 éléments principaux au même des termes. Modèle de planification, ressources humaines et flux du personnel. Alors, en fait, à partir du moment où on commence à travailler avec ces unités très longues, mais qui correspondent soit à un concept, soit à l'union de 3 concepts, eh bien, une voie nouvelle de la recherche morphosyntaxique est dès lors ouverte. Et je remets donc, je renvoie aux travaux de Nakos et Portelance, par exemple. Et c'est là où je reviens à mon 3e point. Donc, quelques matrices terminogéniques dans les sciences sociales et humaines du travail et quelques données. Donc, dans la grande majorité des termes et du point de vue morphologique, sont composés d'unités construites par la composition syntagmatique. Le français et le portugais trouvent des modèles similaires de composition syntagmatique, ce qui n'est pas étonnant puisque ce sont des langues de la même famille généalogique. La matrice terminogénique la plus représentative est celle des mononominaux du type nom plus adj, suivie par celle des binominaux, nom plus prep plus non. Et il semble également y avoir une sorte de limite à 5 éléments, comme par exemple non plus prep plus non plus prep plus non. À partir du 5e élément, ça casse. Donc, on estime la limite du syntagme terminologique à 4-5 éléments. Pour qu'il renvoie donc à un seul concept. Dans la plupart des matrices formées à partir de 4 éléments, nous pouvons donc remarquer l'existence de syntagmes à l'intérieur de syntagmes plus complexes, comme emboîté. 2, 3, ça va. Alors, quelques résultats, sur un échantillon d'environ 200 termes, en portugais et en français, nous pouvons aboutir aux résultats suivants. Pour les mononominaux non plus âge, 35%. Là, il n'y a que quelques exemples. Il n'y a pas la liste complète. Non plus âge, 1%. Pour les binominaux, non plus prep plus non, 19,5%. Non plus prep plus non plus adjectif, 3,5%. Et non plus âge plus préposition plus non, 2,5%. Pour les trinominaux, donc non plus prep plus non, 2%. Ben, c'est vrai, ils ne sont pas faciles à utiliser. Et ça, que dans le discours écrit. Hein. Il fallait dire que je ne travaille sur ces questions que sur des corpus écrits. Alors, quelques conclusions. Dans un échantillon de 200 termes, nous pouvons constater qu'environ 65% sont des syntagmes terminologiques, ce qui est bien signifiant. Il est sans doute important pour le linguiste, le terminologue, le traducteur, le rédacteur technique ou l'apprenant d'une langue étrangère d'avoir accès à ce genre de données linguistiques spécialisées et de s'en servir pour une connaissance plus approfondie des mécanismes de créativité, de variation et d'innovation lexico-terminologique. Et puis, juste quelques références de base. Et merci beaucoup. Obrigada pela vossa atenção. Non, pas simple. J'ai sauté, je vais vous dire, la moitié des conclusions, mais bon, je me suis tenue quand même
Recording
aux 2
stopped.
principales conclusions.
Ah, mais on vous posera des questions, ça me pose des doutes. Merci beaucoup, Isabelle.
Merci. Merci.
Ah, très bien. La troisième intervenante est en ligne. Mais là, mes compétences techniques sont pas limitées, elles sont 0. Je fais ma place. Rapide, hein.
Je ne sais pas ce qu'il y a avec le réseau. L'important, c'est connecter. Pamela, você está online?
Ah, let's get.
Na Terra, você está conectado? Está conectado, então não sei o que.
Ah,
É que eu tiro aqui para sair dessa página. Não, não. Vou ter que fechar.
Fechou?
perception visuelle en portugais et en français.
É isso que tá. Esse, talvez?
É o parlante, talvez.
Esse, vamos lá. Peraí.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Pamela Fagundes Travassos. Je vais... Ao contrário.
Não, ela já está apresentando. Não é isso. Isso. O segundo. Eu fiz o primeiro. Esse é o meu computador. Esse aqui.
Pamela Fagundes Travassos. Je vais parler sur la variation syntaxique.
Pelo dedo do ordinateur. Tester le haut-parleur. Então. Alors.
Des prédicateurs complexes. Bonjour, je m'appelle Pamela Fagundes Travassos. Je vais parler sur la variation syntaxique des prédicateurs. Bonjour. Bonjour, je m'appelle Pamela Fagundes Travassos. Je vais parler sur la variation syntaxique des prédicateurs complexes de la
Pausa, reproduzir.
perception visuelle en portugais et
Ouvimos e parou, né? Si j'essaye un autre truc. Oui. No Zoom vocês estavam ouvindo?
O computador não está ligado ao alto-falante. Não tem alto-falante.
Sim,
Meu
estava
computador.
chegando o áudio.
O problema é a conexão com a distância, né? Com o canal correto. Je fais un download de cette présentation et en ligne et suivre en distance la transmission de la vidéo aussi. Je vois que ça. Attendez, um minutinho, vou tentar aqui uma outra coisa. O ideal seria baixar o arquivo e reproduzir no computador, é isso.
Bonjour. Bonjour, je m'appelle Pamela Fagundes Travassos. Je vais parler sur la variation syntaxique des
Mas é porque tem que
prédicateurs
escolher o canal
complexes
certo para que
de la
eles escutem em
perception
casa e eles
visuelle
escutem e a
en
gente escute aqui,
portugais
porque
et en
quando escolhe
français.
o outro não está ouvindo, e
Type de
vice-versa,
pause,
entende?
configuration
Esse é o
et
problema.
structure informationnelle.
Esse aqui é o vídeo que eu baixei, não é? Vamos tentar.
Nous avons analysé des prédicateurs complexes des perceptions visuelles avec un verbe support dépendant de certains attributs du pôle
Então,
formel,
eles ouvem em casa.
à
provavelmente.
savoir les types de propositions.
Se ouve em
On
casa,
va parler sur la variation générale et la structure informationnelle.
eu vou enviar em casa pelo chat, a gente envia o vídeo em
Nous
casa.
avons observé
Essa
cet
aqui,
objet
porque senão-
d'étude dans deux langues romanes, les portugais, variété du Brésil, et les portugais, variété du Portugal, et les français. Bonjour, je m'appelle
Et
Pamela
d'accord,
Fagundes
gente.
Travassos. Notre perspective théorique est la grammaire des constructions. Pamela Fagundes Travassos. Perspective je vais parler sur la variation syntaxique des prédicateurs complexes de la perception visuelle en portugais et en français. Type de pause, configuration et structure informationnelle. Nous visons donc à étudier la variation syntaxique. Nous avons analysé des prédicateurs complexes des perceptions visuelles avec un verbe support, dépendant de certains attributs du pôle formel. Voici des exemples les types de propositions. La configuração número 1. Na verdade, gostaria realmente de que meus pensamentos pudessem transpor as escolhas que são encontradas ao longo da vastidão do mar da memória. Pois quem lhes lança uma olhadela não acredita. Ao contrário, crê em sua doce e angélica fisionomia. Se va parler sur la variation syntaxique des prédicateurs complexes de la perception visuelle en portugais et en français, qui se trouve le long de nos configurations et structures informationnelles. Car celui qui les regarde n'y croit pas. Au contraire, nous avons analysé des prédicateurs complexes des perceptions visuelles.
Não tem mais a imagem. Temos o som, não temos a imagem. Bom.
Peut-être mieux l'attendre, et puis c'est tout, hein, il va